Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm happy to be here in Abu Dhabi to deliver this talk. From workplace to a workforce, we'll try to examine whether we have found new things or new understandings as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic that we all are coping from and learning to live with. So one of the most important things that we have all done as a result of the pandemic is that in order to maintain our business continuity, we literally moved to working from home in full capacity. This was never something that most of the companies out there have intended to do, to be 100% virtual workforce or to maintain an infrastructure and architecture that would support such a thing. What we have seen is that remote access has become pretty much the norm as organizations had to support an entirely remote workforces in order to support their business continuity. We all know that this had created a situation in which the gap between ideal security and actual security had exponentially grew, and we will be talking about it in length in the next few slides. The other interesting thing is that if you think about it, not really a lot has changed. It's not that working from home at the pandemic era has changed the fact that we share our home network with our vacuum cleaners, with our TVs, our audio receivers, our wireless speakers, our thermostats, and worst of all, with our other family members. I don't know if you guys have seen this or experienced the same, but I'm sure you did. I have 3 kids, and they all have iPads, and I seriously don't know what they're pressing and what they're doing, and what does this mean to my entire network security. Now, it's not that we're going to install a new router, and by the way, possibly your iPhone ARM processor is going to be much more faster and capable than that router CPU. So we have to live it the same way that any remote worker had to live with prior to the pandemic. So nothing has changed, but rather the numbers and the fact that maybe the people now being much more educated about the issues that we face. When we look at security, and when we look at our problems, and we look at the modules that we used, we started from the good old castle model, where things were pretty much simple. We had very good understanding of what are the perimeter idea is. You can see that it was pretty much drone. It was built around those physical boxes that literally created a physical separation between us and them. And who are those us and them were? It pretty much were the people that IT had given devices to, controlled, and basically limited their access due to the fact that we thought that the fact that we gave devices to our users means that we can trust them better than others who were not part of our organizations, did not have a device from the organization, and were not under the same trustable schema that had trust as a function of ownership and control. That's something that we all understand now. That binary and static trust model basically worked in a way that access was either granted or not, and once it was granted, it was literally forever. If you remember back in the day, the only thing that you were limited with is the amount of time you could be connected to the organization, whether this would be hours, days, or forever, and then you had to re-authenticate. And pretty much the entire interaction between people, devices, and data was static, and we pretty much, were able to define what it is and what we wanted to do. The only thing that really was moving and changing was the attack surface. So if you remember the way that we used to assess our security back in way back, we would conduct an assessment, we would understand what's not working, we would change that, and we will repeat the process because literally we only had one item we had to look at, which was, again, the threat landscape. We all know that this model had failed. I would argue that this model never worked. That's a discussion for after the conversation. But today it's much easier to look 20 years back or 25 years back and kind of look at that world and try and understand whether those models were good when they were introduced. We feel like they were. We feel like they were doing what they had to do back in the day. But if we give it the understanding that we have today, then they didn't. They didn't work from day one because you could literally bypass them then as you bypass them today. What we are basically saw is literally an understanding that all of our vectors are in the move. And we know that in today's day and age, and actually for the past, I would say at least 10 years, we know that that model is not working. And it's not working because we now need to support a situation in which anywhere, anytime access is given to users that not all of them are ours, using devices that has not been commissioned by all of them by us, supporting applications that we don't literally own, and basically allowing all of it to operate in order to maintain our business. So that anywhere, anytime access, which as is needed for remote access and was always needed for remote access to the applications by those employees working from home that usually just want to get their work done by using whatever devices they feel like using and accessing any type of application they need, literally is only one example of why this model never worked. We can, of course, now add the rest of the estate of our other users that needs the same type of access due to the pandemic, and that attack surface had been exponentially grew because now everyone works from home and need that type of an access, and our organizations, in some senses, were not really prepared to something like this. Now, the growth in remote work also has led to increase in the use of bring your own devices. I know of examples that some companies have basically allowed their users to use their home machines. They don't even know what those machines are running, just for them to maintain their business continuity. So literally, this provides a great entry point to an organization's environment. The endpoint is the actual, well, I'll say it like that. The endpoint is the best entry point you can hope for getting into an organization these days. We'll talk about this in a few slides and we'll show some examples. And looking at it, we now look at a situation in which we have no real control over the rules that can be provided, or we can't really define that interaction between people, assets, and data anymore because there are simply too many options and possibilities to account for. Something that was really, really simple, it now turned into a multi-dimensional vector that we really need to deal with, and we really need to define a different way to provide with access controls to those who really need it, and to provide with a security model that can attest for what we really need these days. Now, when I say these days, again, apologies because we're trying to apply it to the pandemic days, but literally this is, again, something that we know that does not really work for the past, few years. Unfortunately, there are other problems that we need to deal with, and a broken security model is not the only one. A few years back when I keynoted about this at Hack in a Box in Singapore back in 2015, we had only a few of the problems that are listed here as something that was really applicable on those days. But now what we can see is that certain things had dramatically changed. One example is the use of SaaS applications that if we connect it with data sprawl, which wasn't really a huge problem back 6 years ago, now gets data to basically flow everywhere. You ask yourself where your organizational data is. And I'm sure that a lot of people will not be able to answer that question. Look at yourself and how you use your devices and your applications and how you take data that was generated by one application and you just use it as an input to another without even thinking about it. The same goes with your enterprise data. It has gone the same type of used by some other applications, some of them sanctioned, some of them are not. The end result is that the organization doesn't really know where it is and doesn't really know, where to find it. Other issues that we have is the fact that nation states are really much more closer to cyber criminals in their knowledge and sophistication. There are multiple examples for that. I'm not going to go into it. We still see that the easiest way to get into an organization is just to use the fact that software is complex and networking is complex, and people will find a way to get into the organization. There's a great quote here by Rob Joyce, who used to be the head of the TAO at NSA. Other issues that we know for long are the fact that there is a significant shortage in cybersecurity skills. There is still an amazing amount of data that we need to consume, sort, and digest about the organization. Now you ask yourself, oh yeah, we had SIM, we have SOAR, we have EDR, now we have XDR, and still we're facing the same issues of trying to piece together what are the different actions that are being taken by users when they are interacting with their applications and data. Still an open issue, still an open problem, and there's no simple way to go about and to fix it. Privacy. Privacy is a huge topic that I'm not sure how many people are really aware of how much it is showing its effect over security and over other fields. One of the main effects that was caused by the leaks that Snowden did was a significant uptick in the adoption of encryption. A significant adoption in the understanding of the public of what privacy means. And we see that those things are still in effect, and they are changing the way that we do things. Now, with the fact that we have more data, and the fact that it moves in much more speed, and the fact that we apply encryption to nearly everything, that also affects the different network based security capabilities that we have, that some of them are turning dark because of the fact that we now use, for example, more certificate pinning and more, there are now more voices to go about and, implement TLS 1.3 for real and not use those technologies in a way that will still leave a way to do man in the middle of water. And we see this fight as something that is increasing and not decreasing. And I'm certain that what we're going to see is that capabilities that we may have today at some aspects on the network will simply die down because of those things. Now, if you're using Google or some Apple services, that I can tell you that you're definitely using certificate pinning, and nobody can look at that data without subverting in advance the application. Although there are ways for organizations to still prevent using certificate pinning on the Google apps if they change some settings on the applications themselves on the desktop side. This is something that the average Joe at home, of course, is not changing, and that's how those services are being provided. One of the interesting things here is that we tend to forget the problems of yesterday, and we're always looking at the problems of today. But the fact is that they're still there. They're not gonna, they're not gone. They're just sometimes much more emphasized by what we are seeing today. So whatever we're talking about now, it's the same problems that we know of for some time. They're not new. They're just being much more emphasized by, the pandemic and the effects of having more people work from home. But those problems and those issues, they had been here. They're not new. It's just the ability to understand how much they're now contributing to the fact that we're not as secure as some people would like to think about it. Okay. So, if we have spoken about those issues for long, so what should we be doing? How are we gonna, or what are we need to be focusing on? We need to focus on the data, because eventually information is what powers our organization. It's what makes our organizations viable, right? And eventually, in the era that we live in, that is what really fuels the economy, and that's what organizations needs to use in order to get more insights about their customers, about the environments they're working on, etc. And in reality, what we have done, we've gone a complete circle back to the beginning, back to what information security is all about. And I don't need to read to you the definition, but I remember when I started, in security around 25 years ago. I'm an oldie, I would admit it. Apologize for all the youngsters that goes around here. We learned the definition. We learned what it means. We learned what do we need to do in order to try and make sure that we adhere to that definition. And what we need to do now is we need to do the same thing, because we basically lost control over all the other elements. We lost control over the users, we lost control over the devices, we lost control over the infrastructure. And the last item that we were left with is the way that we need to apply in order to control our data. And if we want to control our data, that we will still be able to control who accesses it and provide the access in the right time and the right moment for the right reasons, we need to make sure that we connect the dots in a way that would allow us to do that. We need to make sure that we remember that what the most important thing that we need to have is that visibility into what the user does with the application it is using and with the data that is interacting with. Because eventually that data is the thing that we need to secure. That data is the lifeblood of the organization, but also is key in order to make sure that it doesn't go to places that it doesn't need to go. And without an understanding of how this interaction is happening, and without that mapping between the users, the applications, the systems, and the other channels, the processes that store and share that data, we will not be able to really understand how to build that policy and how to apply controls that needs to be, on the access side, but also on the use side of the data, so they apply to different parts, and not just for the access itself. Okay. So if we want to look at how the endpoint interacts with applications or things today, this illustration provides hopefully a good understanding of how it looks. Literally, we don't have a perimeter anymore. Not one that we can draw, and not one that we can relate to. We literally live in a world where the network perimeter itself is gone. It's more like islands that we have. We have the device you use island, we have your identity island, we have the application you use island. But regardless of the way that you want to look at that, there is no perimeter. We can't really say there is one, or to say, oh, this is the last line, or this is our Alamo. I don't think that line really exists at this point. But what we really need to understand is that the endpoint is the vista point into all the interactions that happens between our users, applications, and data. It's the point where we have users and identities being authenticated through. We have developers that are interacting with code repositories, users setting up and working on cloud workloads, users interacting with their SaaS applications, with their on-premise applications, etc., etc. You access your file storage wherever it is. The endpoint is really the center of all of it, and it's also the center of risk, because if we're allowing users that use their home machines to access some of our services, then you can get the picture of what may happen if someone will have access to those machines. So it actually is the gateway and the doorway into all of the crown jewels of an organization, if we want it or not. Okay? And it doesn't take much to lose control over who's accessing our data, because I don't think that organizations today really have a good accounting over who, from an identity perspective, using what, is touching their data, and understand how that is being done. Because the whole idea of understanding what are the devices that even belong to the organization is something that the industry had tried to solve for many years, only to fail at that situation again and again and again. Looking into the pandemic, we can see now that, when you allow home machines to connect to your infrastructure or to your applications without any proper provisioning, or when you have a problem trying to have an inventory of all of those machines, and especially what are they running and whether they're in a good state, then the chances are that an infiltration on one of those machines will basically get you a significant damage to your organization. In some cases, it might be a fatal one. Another interesting point is that we are moving from managing devices to managing policy, and I wrote here that presence is key. So in a lot of cases, people say, oh, we will be installing agents on managed devices. Agents means software, that would safeguard that endpoint. And my opinion is it doesn't really matter. Meaning that I can take the same software, install it on my home machine, and get the policy that I need in order to safeguard the assets of the company, regardless if the company owns my machine or it doesn't own my machine. The whole idea is the company needs to have the ability to push its policy and make sure it's being enforced on any device that has access to its infrastructure. So it doesn't really matter whether this is something that the company owns or not. It's also going to be something that would be needed when third parties will try to access the same infrastructure to do whatever they need in order to sustain their contracts with the company. So making sure that we're able to still enforce the policy does not mean that we need to own the device, and this is a point that needs to be highlighted. Another interesting point is that a lot of our security capabilities are moving to the edge. Back in 2018, I did a talk at Hack in the Box in Amsterdam about data center security. And we were talking about the fact that in data center security, you see the security and the decision making being pushed to the host and being done by the hypervisor and the vSwitch that exist in those machines. Why? Because you can't make decisions on the network because of the need not to introduce any latency to the traffic that goes into the data center. Something very similar is happening here. What you're going to see, also because the data is the network, getting darker. The network is getting darker and then dumber because we use more encryption, that the decisions of whether or not to do something would have to be pushed to the endpoint, because it will be the only point that will know what data or what action is being asked and being done before something like this will be moved or sent to the network. In that regards, the host becomes the center point of risk, whether this is accessing all the different services that we allow, whether this is just the internet or sanction apps or any other ones, and of course the local interaction that host has with other channels of use. It's kind of weird that I can't ask whether you have questions, because we're doing this in a silent way. So I'll push forward. So if we look at things and ask ourselves, okay, so how do we need to, or after what do we need to apply the way that we do access management, and how do we need to look at it, and how after we listed all the parts that are not being done right, how can we actually go about and get to a point where we can still allow access, but access with provisions. And so the analogy that I have selected to use is an airport security model analogy. And there's a reason why I chose it, because it's a very similar problem looking at the anywhere, anytime access by any user, right? Why? Because at the airport, what you have is that anyone can claim they need to be at the airport, right? At least at the grounds. Anyone can purchase a flight ticket. The lists that are associated with the no-flight lists are not on the websites of the carriers. They're actually at the airport. But the most important thing is that there's no control over the contents of whatever you packed. And security doesn't really know where it had been right before you took it to the airport. And the last one is that they cannot afford to search your luggage. So if you look at this, it's like anyone can be there anywhere at any time, right? Users and devices, you can have an applicability to the travelers and their luggage, and still you need to establish some sort of a trust, right? And you need to have checks to say, okay, what's the level of risk that I'm allowing, and how am I going to be able to check that level of risk and still provide a safe passage to all of those travelers, using the airport, right? So since I'm an Israeli, and since our method of things had been built across the years, because of the experience we had to go through, the model that the Israeli airport uses pretty much fits the analogy of what we need to do here. It's a multi-stage continuous process that is built by examining behavior and context at multiple different checkpoints. Those checkpoints may be linked or not with each other. Some of them are completely autonomous. Some of them provide feedback to the next few ones that follows. But the whole idea here is that eventually what they do, they are adaptive. So they're designed to make sure that they provide a process that if something changes, if a behavior alerts them, then immediately there is a reaction to what happens here. And I'll go through this and I'll explain what's been done since I became an expert on airport security, since I wanted to make sure that I can explain this proper. So at the start, I don't know if you can see this, but the outer perimeter of the airport has a ditch. Okay, so no car can go through other than into the main gate, right? It has an electrical fence. It has unmanned cars. It has dogs. It has other stuff. This is what I'm telling you is all open data. Okay, it's nothing that I'm telling you that is not being publicized already. It has all sorts of other capabilities to make sure that nobody can just stroll through the airport and just get into the airport other than the main gate. If you had been to this airport, you know that the passenger itself has or is feeling, because in Israel, when you fly home, especially for foreigners from Israel, they feel the process, and I explain how they feel it. That's very, it's not a simple process to foreigners, but as you go through the entrance, a profiler will ask you a question. It might be, how are you doing? Etc. And what they will do, they'll listen to your response, and they'll try to understand what is your dialect. So they'll try to make a quick screening and see whether or not you look a bit tense, you look a bit suspicious. In 99.999% of the cases, nobody will stop anybody. But at that 0.001 case, that works too. So there were cases at which people were trying to actually break into one of the cargo companies that have representation at the airport. The likes of FedEx, UPS, etc. And they got panicked at the entrance, so they got caught even not entering into the airport. There were other cases where people that had bad intentions of doing something bad at the airport, they were caught too. And by the way, if you are to go through that without stopping, then there are other measures that will stop you way before you get to the terminal. And there is a reason why, and I'm not really sure you can see it. The road is curved, okay? All the road. The road is completely curved. This is not to allow you to speed up, and this is to basically force you to slow down. So it gives the response teams more time when they, need to respond if something happens at the main gate. After which, terminal entrance, there's another profiler, there's a metal detector, and in some cases they will ask you to show your passport, boarding pass. But the main event actually happens by a profiler that is asking you questions about why did you choose to waste your time in Israel and be with us visiting the country? And, sometimes it's embarrassing to listen to what they're asking, but they're like unbelievable at their work. They will ask people where they have been, who they have visited, sometimes the names of the people that they have visited, to see whether a person can actually answer and understand or provide proper answers to those questions, right? They will evaluate whether the folks are a bit jumpy, etc., and they have a high successful rate of, grabbing people that are not really have, good intentions. Now, the profiling thing will happen regardless of if you do an online check-in or you go through the counters. And if you're not going to have a special, sticker in your passport while you are trying to go to the boarding area, if you go there, you're not going to go on a plane. Okay? So it's a must stage before you will do that. And there are other measures. People are watching people after they pass metal detectors. They will watch the people throughout what they do in the airport. There are, pressure chambers for luggage. So nothing would have happened at 30,000 feet. And this is something that the rest of the world had used after us. Unfortunately, you learn by experience. And eventually there's also the air marshal, which is, an Israeli invention of, an armed guard on the flight if something goes haywire. So literally, all of this system is designed to continuously look at the passengers and try and understand whether there is an outlier there that they need to take out. But what are they actually doing is they are establishing enough trust that would say, okay, you're fine, boarding the plane. And in most cases, nothing happens. It's like, you don't see people are being dragged, you're not going to get on the flight, right? But they know how to understand that something is wrong, and they build it without prior knowledge about who's going to fly. So they have no clue who's on the manifest. They have no clue. That's not their job. That's the job of other people, okay? That would flag those things if needed. But they have no idea. So they basically build that trust in an instance. Basically built mostly on the context that is being provided to them. Who are you? How they can identify you? Are you an Israeli citizen? Sorry to say that, okay? That's also something that plays a role here. Where are you flying to? They will look at your passport, will look at which countries you have visited, right? If there are people who visit countries that we don't have a relationship with, they will ask you questions about that on entry and when you will leave. And of course, they'll ask you, especially if you're a foreigner, they'll ask you what have you done, who did you met with. There are ways to attest for those things. For example, if you have a visitor coming from a different country for work purposes, you can give them a letter of attestation and talk to security before they go to the airport and explain to them what they've done when they were in country, and basically it will smooth the whole process for them. But the whole idea, again, is to try and get to a point where you establish that level of trust to let you through and let you to, board the plane. Now you ask me, okay, give us examples of when this actually works, right? Because, hey, I just described you how Israel airport security is being obnoxious to all foreigners visiting Israel. The profiling thing works also in disembarkment. So when people come into Israel, and if you've been there, you'll see 2-3 people. Usually there will be a woman too. And they will look at your behavior and they may ask people, it will look to some folks like randomly, questions about, why they come, etc. That's how the shoe bomber was caught when he visited Israel before he tried to, blow the plane on his flight to New York. But there were no evidence of him doing any wrongdoing, so they didn't let him into the country, and they put him on the next British Airways flight back to London. So this method works. It's invasive, and really what we want to get to is to have the user experience as TSA Pre. Now, for those of you who don't know what TSA Pre is a method where you pre-register, you go through a security check, right? And when you are at the airport, it allows you to not to remove your shoes, not to remove your belt, not to remove your laptop from the bag. So it makes the whole process much more user-friendly, but it also gives the government enough data about you to attest for who you are and your intentions before you're at the airport. Now, whoever had the experience of going through regular security in the US, and this is something that if I ever lose that status, that is something to cry for. Seriously, this is like the experience of just go through the line, show passport, get the passport, put your bag, go through, and that's it, towards, okay, shoes, laptop, everything else, belts, the rest of them shows you what the experience needs to be. So if there can be a way to combine between the Israeli way of making sure that you get all the data that you need and that would be a winner, that hopefully, that is what we need. But we need to remember that eventually user experience trumps everything else. Security today is not as it used to be. Security today is basically something that needs to work with what the business is telling us, and user experience usually is the biggest line item on their list. If we can balance between those things, we'll be at a different place. Now, if we come back to the real world and say, okay, how this applies to security, how this can actually go to something that we can use in order to make our lives better, then we also need to provide a way to understand and get the right context about those that are trying to get access to our infrastructure, services, data, applications. And it's a bit more than what people really think, because it's not just to say, oh yeah, that user had two-factor authentication, so here's the door is open and they can go through. That's absolutely incorrect. How many of you use two-factor? I assume all of you, right? How long does that two-factor holds after you need to do the two-factor again? 24 hours? 12 hours? 6 hours? At that time, your username and password is king. Okay? So, depending if you're owned, you can make the calculation yourself and understand what someone who may have access to your system can do once you're done your two-factor. Can go same places, doesn't really matter. So there needs to be something much more here. Something that will allow the anywhere, anytime, any device, any user, but will provide not just allow or deny type of a way to access applications and data, would allow something that would still allow things, but with an asterisk. What are you actually requesting? People tend to ignore the fact that it's not just your authentication or to attest to your identity and how is your identity had been proven. For example, username, password versus biometric versus two-factor with biometric is a complete different thing, right? So what is the mechanism that was used in order to attest for your identity? Does your passport has biometric identification? Is it biometric, right? Can you attest for the passport itself that attests for you as a person? Same here. Are you using Windows Hello? Are you using a different method? Are you using some other way to attest for you? Does your machine has the hardware that can help attest for your location, for your identity, for other things? How good is that hardware? So we can take each one of those line items and pretty much say, okay, we can provide a varying degrees of trust with the information that we have, even within those different parameters. But eventually, things like location, and not the country you're in, but the network that you're on, right? And the network, by the way, of the resource that you want to consume is on, is super critical to make a decision whether or not we're going to allow you to access, and to make sure that this process is repeatable with every transaction that you're requesting. Because just doing this for authentication is pretty much useless. But the real deal is to apply this to authorization. So when you're requesting a resource, to ask, hey, under these conditions, can this individual using this device from this location that was authenticated this way, that his device or her device is, healthy, that runs the stuff that we wanted to run, can access that resource, and what does it mean? Does that host has the ability to protect the data that it will now be consumed from that resource, looking at the risk level that data has? And that's usually a question that nobody is asking. So if we're not going to be looking at the behaviors of people, understanding the history of the device, understand whether it's vulnerable or not, understand its criticality, and then look at what we're asking from the other side. What is this asset that we're trying to interact with, or that application? What type of data it contains? Is it critical to the organization? What's going to happen to the data that is going to be downloaded from that resource? Or what does it mean to view the information from that system, etc.? We will not be ever able to provide with an ability to protect the data that we want, and of course needs to be protected on the device itself if downloaded to the device too. It also means that there needs to be some sort of an invasive process or an invasive software. I'm going to put it out there because it is what it is. That will be able to track those things, trying to balance between the need to get that understanding, trying to balance between the need to understand that behavior, to the privacy of the individual that is using this device. And by the way, that individual may be using multiple devices, so whatever their behavior may be across all of those devices eventually needs to be correlated and looked at from one single pane. So how does this eventually correlate to the things that who can access what? And there's a reason why I put the bull and the bear here. You can choose who's the security and who's the privacy one, okay? But eventually, if you really want to go to the top secret data, your device will need to be, running the type of software that organization would mandate under the condition of the organization, and it will be a small part of the entire population of the users of that organization that will be able to access that data, because the value of the asset and the risk that it poses due to the fact that it accesses this data or has the ability to access this data is most critical to the organization. And we can't run away from it and pretend, oh yeah, I have a bring your own device and I want to access my quarterly numbers before they're being published to the market. Those days are done. Like, those thoughts of organization prior to COVID-19 are done. I've been talking to organizations prior to COVID-19 and after COVID-19. And organizations were really open to bring your own device, do what you want. And now they have much more stricter rules. Because those endpoints, as I mentioned earlier on, they have access to everything. And if we don't apply a proper way to measure continuously the trust and risk with every access request, and by the way, that access request might be to a file on your machine. It doesn't need to be a file on a remote SaaS application that you don't own or control, which is a different story for a different day. Then there's no way of securing this. And eventually, the final piece that needs to be added here is the ability to protect that data once it's on the machine, and of course, it needs to be at rest, in transit, and in use. And make sure that those access controls, whether on access, whether on data, are enforced on everything and anything, and you're able to provide with an understanding and the visibility in a continuous manner to really understand what your users are doing and how they use applications and how they interact with the data, in order for you to come with a way to apply this in the real world, because eventually those devices and those users are not born equal. So I would like to thank you all. I know that doing I call it a silent presentation is hard on you too, because you can't ask any questions, but I'll be here for the next few minutes if you want to just give feedback or ask questions. Thank you for coming, and I look to see you tomorrow too. Thank you. Appreciate it.